Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. And I know it's before opening ceremony, but yeah. So I thought it might be to get it over with so I can enjoy the rest of the of the conference. Okay, so what I'll do is I will share my screen. 1 second. Here is a map, of course, of Australia. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the languages in Australia, their structure, phonology, a little bit about the grammar, a little bit about the sociolinguistics, and also the current situation, like are people learning the languages, which languages are more vibrant, which ones are being passed down to the next generation, which ones are being replaced by English or maybe some Creole language in some areas. We'll look at this as well. And maybe also about the connections between Australia and the rest of the surrounding areas, because it's very interesting. We'll take a look at the maps and we'll go to each one of these main areas. Okay, so first things first, how many languages were spoken in Australia? Right, let's go to that. That's a very controversial subject as well. This is a map of basically it's an excellent map. Check out iatsis.gov.au. It's got a map of all the languages. Sometimes it's a bit blurred, which is a language and which is a dialect, for example, but we'll look at them. So there were approximately 200 to 300 languages at the time of European contact. So when the first Europeans arrived, between 200 to 300 languages. Some classify even as many as 500, depending on what's a language, what's a dialect. Okay, so that's always the eternal question. Currently, there are about, out of this number, there's only about 100 languages that are in use across Australia, daily language. In use, that means it can be anywhere from 10 speakers to 3,000, 3, 4, 5,000 speakers, but that's about the limit. Traditionally in Australia, a lot of the communities were very small, were nomadic. So maybe one language might be spoken by 5,000 people at most. Some languages may be up to 10,000, but by, so that they're really small. We don't have languages like ancient Chinese that are spoken by millions of people. No, it's very small communities. The majority today are highly endangered, unfortunately. Right, so let's just take a look. So these languages, so we're looking at language, this is not language, this is language families, all right? So most linguists classify the languages into two groups, so that the colorful group there and this big yellow area. The big yellow area, it's what we call Pamanyungan. And the reason why they come to this conclusion is because the ones in the yellow area share a lot of common vocabulary, maybe some grammar, but it's very different. The grammar can be quite different from area to area, but these languages will share a lot of core vocabulary. And the ones in yellow, they are either isolates or they are small language families by themselves. But there's a lot of controversy as well, because some linguists say that actually the yellow area is made up of several language families that, because they have influenced each other for so long, like the past, Australia has been settled for what, 40, 50,000 years, maybe more. They just resemble each other, what the Germans call a Sprachbund. Basically, the languages begin to resemble each other. So maybe the Pamanyungan, the yellow area, might be made of smaller groups. Other linguists say, actually, the whole thing is one giant macro family, and just because of the time gap, languages have changed and evolved in separate ways. But there are certain things in common. A lot of the languages, in fact, most of the languages, share very similar phonology. Across Australia, you've got very similar sound systems. Some core vocabularies are very similar, like the word for hand, or to touch, to handle, to take, is something like ma. And that's found across Australia. And you have that word. The word for I is always something like mih, meh, mil, something like that. So, so it's that kind of thing. Who knows? Maybe they are related. I'm more of a macro family kind of guy, but it depends. So we'll let the philologists and sort of what do you call it, the historical linguists reconstruct what they think. But anyway, we'll go to let's take a look at some interesting facts. So the languages with the largest numbers, these are sort of like the largest numbers of speakers today. So you've got languages like Tuwal, Aranda. Aranda, the second one, is actually a group of dialects that are very closely related. So it can be, a language can be a dialect, it depends on your definition. Pitjantjatjara is also very big. Warlpiri is very common. Most of these languages, if you know where they're spoken, are either central Australia or further north. So the southern coastal languages and on the east coast, most of them are unfortunately either extinct or severely endangered. And we'll take a look why later on. So Central Australia and the northern parts and parts of the Western Desert, they still maintain these languages. All right. So these are languages from both families. I've added them all together. So, right. Yeah. Now look at phonology. Very interesting. So a lot of languages have only 3 vowels, I, U, A. All right, some languages have a long or short variant, depending on the word. Some languages only allow long vowels in the first syllable, some of them other parts of the word, it depends. Languages in the north, non-Pama-Nyungan languages, some of them have 5 vowels, so E, A, R, O, U, and a few of them have something like U or U as well. So that's like 6 vowels maximum. I don't know of any language that has those rounded vowels you find in European languages, and U. I don't, as far as I know, none of them have that. There are regions in the central desert area where the languages have even reduced this vowel inventory to only 2, A and E, and that's it. So you've got a quite narrow range of vowel sounds. All right. The consonants, on the other hand, are quite complicated. There are usually no voicing contrast, so the P and B and T and D, K, G are quite the same. A lot of them, in fact, most languages, they have the R sound, which is very, very common, depending on the language. Some languages have up to 3 types of R sounds, like Warlpiri has Erda, Ra, and Ra. So Erda, Ra, Ra. Erda is like, I think Pashto has something very similar to this sound. Erda is a flap sound, and then there's a trill, and and the typical approximate Ra. Most languages have at least 2, so Ra and Ra. Something like in modern Albanian, I hear people say Ra and Ra all the time. That's something very similar to that. Retroflex consonants are very, very common. So these are the sounds you make by curling your tongue, if you can see my hand, up to the top of your mouth, the top to the heart palate. Ta, na, la. These are very, very common. Some languages have pre-stop nasals. I can't pronounce them very well. Ma, na, 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 nya, nga. Something like that. All right. So you have Aranda has Apmara, Utnamma. Okay. And I can't see this word here. Oh, Atnamma. Yeah, digging stick. So Aranda makes a distinction between a ta, the stop that touches where you put your tongue right at your teeth, ta, and a ta, which is like the T in English. It's a little bit further back, and a ta. So there are 3 sort of T sounds, and a ja. So that's a sort of a palatal sound. In fact, all the languages except one exception do not have fricative sounds. There's no sa, sh, zh that you find in Europe. They don't exist in Australia. Some languages have developed secondary sounds, like a T sound, a ta between vowels becomes a the, like in Spanish. Some languages, the B or the P sound, when it's between 2 vowels, become a v, like in Spanish as well. Some of them, but that's a secondary development. Okay, a K sound between vowels might become a the, something like that. But again, the Proto-Pama-Nyungan language did not have fricative sounds. Kalalagaoya is an exception. I'm going to turn on my. I don't know how to turn on the pointer. Anyway, Kalalagaoya is the one that has at the very top. If you can see my mouse, I'm not sure if you can see it. The very top end of the Torres Straits, there's a sort of between Miriam Mir, right? That area up north, that is, I'll bring it like this. Yeah, there we go. So between Muralag and Kalalagaoya, Miriam, right? The Torres Straits. So you're looking at the eastern side, West Cape, East Cape. They go all the way up to the top end. So that's the Torres Straits. So that language has been influenced, or the dialects there have been influenced by Papuan languages. So that's why they often have sounds, an S and an F, and I think a Z sound that other Australian languages do not have. Okay, this is part of an influence. And the languages there, in fact, if you look to the east of Kalalagaoya, the very top, there's Miriam Mir, that yellow island thing. That area is actually a Papuan speaking area. It's the only language in Australia that is related to the languages in Papua New Guinea. So again, there's mutual contact and many, many centuries of contact with them. Kalalagaoya has, in fact, influences from, it's not only Australian and Papuan, but also Austronesian influence. So that's probably where the contact is. We'll look at, if we have some time, we'll look at the languages in the north, some of the vocabulary, because there's a lot of Austronesian influence, especially in the North Arnhem Land and along the coast as well. So we'll look at that in terms of vocabulary, not so much pronunciation, right? So yeah, so about half of Australian languages have 6 places of articulation. So I'm going to read this out in Aranda. I don't speak it, but I will try. So Marla means girl. Nanna, when you touch the front of your teeth, your top teeth, nanna means here. Anamma is to sit. Anam. Arna is a tree, so that's retroflex. Anyanda is one. Anyanda or anyand. That's your tongue actually touches the bottom teeth, and the middle of your tongue goes up. So nya, like a sort of a dome shape. Anyanda. and ngana is yo, nga, nga. Nga is a very common sound throughout Australia, and you can find it in the beginning, in the middle, at the end of words, nga, nga, nga. Some northern languages have a phonemic glottal stop, so that's in Kunwingu, you have a pinin, pinin, so that the NJ in this language is a nya sound, pinin, pinin, which means people. So that there's a distinction it's usually written H, because most languages don't have, in this area, don't have the H sound anyway. So that's actually a glottal stop that you'll find it. That's how they pronounce it. All right, so yeah, so just to let you know where Kunwinjgu is spoken, it is the Arnhem Land. You see Arnhem Land on the, to your left, and right there, that's you can see Rumbaranga, Dangbon, Kunwinjgu, and below Maung and Iwaija and all that, and Burara right below Nakara. Those languages, those are dialects that are spoken in that area. All right, they are non-Pamanungan. We'll look at some of the characteristics later on. Okay, now let's look at the morphology. Okay, it's a lot of information, so I'm trying to. I will take my time. So most languages have a very, very free word order system. So the first point and the second point are connected. So there's a free word order system. So you don't have a subject, object, verb in a fixed order. You can arrange it in any way, and it will still make sense. The nouns almost always, except some languages in very far north, majority of languages have a complex noun case system. So you have it's not like, say, classical Arabic where you have the nouns have a case, but you can drop it when you're speaking. No, most languages you have to use it because the word order is completely free very often. All right. Most of these languages have a tense system. In European languages, more tense. So you have tense marking. In some languages, it's usually on the verb. In others, point number 3, many of the Pamanungan languages, especially in the central desert area and a little bit to the outlying regions, they have the tense, and they also have a separate word that attaches to the first word in the first word or phrase in the sentence, and they combine with the verb. It becomes it gives you the meaning of the tense. All right, it's a little bit like the auxiliary system in English. I will go. Je vais manger. Something like that. Russian, ya budu gavarit, so that you have the main verb and you have some kind of helping verb together. Many languages use the system, but also many don't. So we'll look at some of them. All right, that's point number 4. And if you go down there, the non-Pamanungan languages, very often they have a system where you've got a verb, and then you've got a prefix and you have a suffix. The prefix will be all the subject, object will be combined. So it's a lot like if you study Cherokee, if you study the Iroquois languages, very similar structure. You've got a prefix that shows the person. I'm doing I see you, I love you. She kicked me. The I and the you and the she, all that is incorporated into one prefix in the beginning. You have the verb stem and you have a suffix to show the tense. So that's very common in the north, the non-Pamanungan languages. Okay. Now, in terms of the syntax, this is very different. This is where it's quite different compared with European languages, for example. Most European languages are sort of nominative and accusative structure, right? I, me, that kind of thing. Australian languages, most of them are either ergative, like Basque, or split ergative. That means different words behave in different ways. So the nouns might behave in a sort of ergative way. The pronouns are actually accusative, nominative, accusative. So you have like 2 or 3 different different syntactic structures in one sentence. Yeah, I'm not joking. We'll take a look at some of the examples. Some languages have tripartite marking, which means that the subject of a transitive verb, the subject of an intransitive verb, the object of a transitive verb are all different in different cases. Yeah, so that again is a very interesting complication. Yeah, so in terms of complexity, actually these languages are probably among the most complex, like syntax, alignment, that sort of thing. So very, very broadly, I said very broadly because there are all obviously exceptions to this. There is a tendency for ergative absolute marking to be found on nouns, all right, and sort of nominative accusative, like I and me, he and him, she and her, on pronouns usually, but some languages have of course call it, there are exceptions to that. Very, very common throughout Australia. First person pronouns, the plurals have 2 forms, I and I and other people, I, other people, and you, the kinds of we and you, we and minus you. So like in Indonesian, Malay, we say kita, kami. Mandarin, in some dialects, 我们, for example. If you speak Tamil, it's nama and nanga. All right, so that kind of difference, it's found throughout Australia, very common. Okay, we'll look at some of the specific languages in the area, Warlpiri, Aranda, Walmajarri, we'll look at the grammars for now, all right? So we'll start with Warlpiri, which is one of the more commonly spoken languages in the Northern Territory. So, all right, here we go. So you have Warlpiri words. So I've got three little very short sentences. The minimum sentence is actually a noun and a noun. This is this, but very common as well. You have a verb and the auxiliary. So this is where the auxiliary system comes in. So you have to remember that the word order is free, but when there's only a verb in a sentence, whatever comes after the verb is the auxiliary. So yulami is to cry, present tense. So the language has in fact two main tenses. Warlpiri, it differs from language to language. So yulami means to cry, but non-past. So I am crying or I will cry. And how do you know which tense it is? You see the next word, kanpa, yulami kanpa. So the kanpa means you, present tense. So you are crying. All right. The word to speak, wangamigarna, I am speaking. And then of course, pangamiga, which means he or she is walking. Okay, so you have yula. So if you look at the analysis, it's always like the verb stem and the suffix to show the tense, past tense or non-past tense. And then you have the auxiliary. All right, so this is in a general structure of a basic sentence, which is a verb. But in a longer sentence, you have the subject, the verb, the object, everything. You can scramble it in any way. As long as the kanpa, karna, ka appear in the second position, then it's correct. That's the only rule. You make sure the auxiliary stays somewhere in the second, as the second word in the sentence. That helps you to sort of identify who is doing what to whom. And the case system, yeah, and then it's pretty clear. All right. So here's a more complex example. When you have the same three verbs, to cry, to speak, to run. On your left-hand column, those are the past tense form. So you actually, in the past tense, all you have to do is to say the verb in the past tense, and you put the pronoun, you stick it right next to it. So yula janpa, all right, means you cried. All right, Wangajarna means I spoke, and Pangaja is just he or she ran. Third person, there's no specific clitic pronoun, so it's just Pangaja. All right, Warlpiri it's different from language to language. Warlpiri distinguishes perfective, imperfective in the past tense. So like Yula Jalpanpa means you were crying. Wanga Jalpana is I was speaking, and Parga Jalpa, he or she was running. There's no gender, but in the past tense you have a split sort of perfective, imperfective. Okay, so it's like Yula Jalpanpa would be like you were crying. It'd be like Russian zi plakala. You were crying when something else happened, you know, that kind of thing. So they have this distinction only in the past tense for Warlpiri. Something like that. Okay, and then in the present tense you have the auxiliary is always ka, so it's yulami. The me ending shows that it's not past tense, and then the ka, it shows present tense, and then the nba or the erna, that's the pronoun basically. Yulmiganba, wangamigarna, parnimiga. And then of course the future version is the same as the present. The verb is the same. The auxiliary changes into the future form, which is kapu, kapunba. Okay, wangami kapuna, parngami kapu. All right, that's how it works in Warlpiri. All right, and when you put more stuff in a sentence, then you can of course scramble it around. It will still make sense as long as all the auxiliaries stay in the second position, like this. So if you want to make a sentence like the man sees the two kangaroos, which is a common occurrence, I imagine, in parts of Australia, you say ngargangu kapalongu marlu jara nyanyi. So here's how it breaks down. So the second word is always the auxiliary, in this case the present tense, kapalangu. So the ka part shows it's present. The palangu part, as you can see here, it's actually a third person subject doing something to a third person dual object. So it's one guy doing something to two things. That's all that information is crammed into kapalangu. And then who is doing what? That's when the case system comes in. So the case system, naruka means man. The ungu is the ergative or instrumental. It shows that the man is doing the action. All right, so that's linked to the man. So kapalangu is, of course, it shows present tense, and it shows that the man is doing something to two things. What are the two things? The next word, marlu kiara. Marlu is kangaroo. Kiara is a dual suffix. All right, and because this is an ergative, split ergative, but nouns are ergative absolute. When there is no suffix, then it's in a transitive sentence. Then this is the object. yeah, it's very different from the European system where the object is always accusative, usually, unless it's Russian when it becomes genitive in some cases. But generally, maru tiara, that's without any other suffix. You know that is the object of the sentence. Nyanyi, the verb here is nyanyi, to see, non-past. So the stem of the verb is nyanyi, and then the ending will change. Warlpiri is a bit like language like French or Italian or some or even Slavic languages, where different verbs belong to different categories. So some verbs will have a certain ending, other verbs are different groups of endings. Warlpiri is the same. So some verbs, the present tense is ni, some it's me, you know, and so on and so forth. Some is ne. Right. So for the word to see is nyanyi in present tense. So this is how we go. I will take questions towards the end. I'll try to leave maybe 5-10 minutes before time is up, and then we can have some question and answer sessions if you're curious to know more. Right. So this is how a typical sentence works in Warlpiri. All right. Then these are all the variations of the same sentence. You can, because the word order is free, you don't have to put subject, verb, object in a specific order. You can put the object at the front, second one. Yeah, you can put the verb at the front. It will still make sense. You can put the subject, verb, object like in English. It will still make sense. There's no ambiguity because of two things. The auxiliary is always in the second position. You know, the second word is always will tell you who does what to whom. And then all the nouns will have a case suffix. And of course, the verb is the verb. It's unique. It has the verb suffix. So you know which is which. All right. So that's how the system works. So yeah, I made it there. So when you construct a sentence, you always have the auxiliary that tells you who does what to whom in second position. The list is quite big. Auxiliaries is like which language, which sort of in Warlpiri, for example, combinations of auxiliary. I do something to you, you did something to me, and he did something to her, yeah, third person did something to third person. It's a very long list of different combinations. That's the complex bit. Now, Walmajarri is of course the fairly close relative. It's spoken more to the Western Desert area. So this is the top. Yes, again, it's towards it's almost towards the Indian Ocean already. You're going towards that area. So Walmajarri is very similar to Warlpiri, but it has a couple of differences. Verbs show all the tense. The auxiliary stays the same, it never changes. So like the man ran north with me is kaili pajarla ngan bayi laparni ngajonga. So the pajarla is the auxiliary, but it never changes for tense. Okay, what changes is the verb. All right. The other thing is that this language has a lot of very elaborate auxiliary system, even more than Warlpiri. You can not only say I did something to you, so subject, object. It can be I gave something, I gave it to her as well, or I did something with someone else. So in this language, if you look at word by word, the word kaili means north. The pajarla means third person singular, he or she did something with me. Not did something to me, that's a different one. Did something with me, okay? So that's a different word. And then nganpayi is the man, but the man doesn't have any suffix because the word laparni is intransitive. Laparni is to run. It doesn't have an object, right? So because of that, nganpayi doesn't have, it's an absolute case. That's how ergative languages work generally. And ngaju, nga means with me in this context. The nga is a suffix that works it's called an accessory case. So it's something, you do something with me. But in some contexts, it can also function like a locative. I am at something or I'm in something. All right. So it's got a few different functions. So that's Walmajarri. So it's very similar to Warlpiri, except for some of these exceptions. That's how the language works. Now, if we look at Aranda is quite interesting. Aranda is one of those languages that's undergone a lot of very complex sound changes. It's like you're learning Latin, and then you learn Italian. Okay, not too different. Then you learn French. Okay, then you realize, French is a bit different. Aqua becomes O, and catena becomes shin, and you know what I mean? A lot of sound changes, right? Canis becomes chien. So you have the same in Aranda. Aranda has a lot of complicated sound changes. Sometimes people can't even identify the word. If you speak a neighboring language, like, what is that? But once you look at it, oh yeah, it's dropped a lot of a final vowel. It's reduced the vowels to schwa. The initial consonant is gone. You find a lot of this in Aranda. All right, Aranda. Okay. The locative and ergative suffixes have merged. A lot of restructuring of the grammar. the language is split ergative as well. So nouns usually have ergative absolute. Pronouns are nominative, accusative, except for I. There are three forms. I do something, in intransitive. I do something to something else, and then something happens to me. These are all different forms. Aranda doesn't have an auxiliary. So pronouns are very important in the system, right? That's it. So if you look at this, it's a lot like French. The E is actually the sound, close enough to French, but it's often dropped, and you pronounce all, unlike in Warlpiri where you pronounce words clearly, you pronounce it smoothly in one way. So it's marlulialanam or something like that. Marlulialanam. Okay, so the girl is sitting in the shade, and if you break it down, it's very similar to how it works in Warlpiri. Marla is the word for girl. Ulya is a shade. Ulyalla is in the shade. So the suffix here is locative. It can also be ergative depending on the verb. And anam is to sit, present tense. The ma is the present tense markups. Yeah. So that's marulilanam. So when you say that very quickly, Warlpiri speakers say that, Aranda speakers, they speak very, very fast, and you can't figure out where one word ends and the other begins. This is why there's a lot of like liaison, like in French, that happens. So if you say the girl is eating meat, because the girl is now the subject, the object is the meat and the verb is eating, then you must marlala. Okay, so it's marlala karal gumma. All right, so kara is meat, kara, and then ail gumma is how they say to eat in present tense. So marlala karal gumma. So marla, girl, la is of course in this case it's not locative, it's the instrumental or ergative. It means the girl is doing something. Okay. And what is she doing it to? She's doing something to kara, the meat, which doesn't have any suffix because it's absolute. And then ail-gumma is the word to eat in the present tense. All right, so that's how the language works. Okay, now that these are the Pama-Nyungan languages. This is generally like the main group in central, southern Australia, a lot of the eastern areas. You go further north, especially to the northwest, things are a little bit different. All right, let's look at Arnhem Land. So Arnhem Land is, I don't have the full map of Australia here. It's the very top. If you know where Darwin is, yeah, that to the east of that, that's all this part is Arnhem Land. This area has mostly non-Pama-Nyungan languages, except Yolngu. Yolngu is classified as a Pama-Nyungan language, but it's an enclave. It's surrounded by non-Pama-Nyungan languages. Yolngu Mata is famous because it was the native language of Yotu Yindi. And a few very famous Australian singers, they come from this area, so they speak dialects. They sing in dialects of Yolngu. There are many dialects. Very interesting in Yolngu and a lot of these languages. The word for white person is Balanda, and if you speak Malay Indonesian, you know that's how we call Dutch people, Balanda. It's a loan word, and the reason was this area was in contact with Austronesian languages from Indonesia, what is now Indonesia. A lot of them came from Sulawesi. So you know where the island is, the one that looks like either a scorpion or a monkey with a long tail. Sulawesi, there's an island, a very unique looking island. The very south, a lot of people speak languages like, I think it's Makassar or Bugis. When I look at loanwords in these areas, it looks a lot to me like Makassar or Bugis, and some Malay. Okay, so probably from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, a lot of Indonesian people from what is now Indonesia, they sailed to this area to trade, to get, I think a lot of them also came to look for trepang, that is, what do you call it, a sea cucumber, which they would then sell to the Chinese, or the Vietnamese, the Chinese especially. That was very common. So these people came in and they brought a lot of words, like in Kunbarlang, which is another language a little bit north of Kunungunyiku. In that area, people say the word for clothes or shirt is baju-baju. Baju-baju from the word for clothing in Malay or Indonesian. I think boat in many languages here is kapala. Kapala. It comes from kapal, right? So you find a lot of these words all around this area, especially. That came either from Malay, but primarily from Bugis and Makassar, the Makassar language of South Sulawesi. All right. So these languages are quite interesting. So most languages in the Pama-Nyungan group do not have gender. These do. The languages here are so usually there are 4 or 5 genders depending on language, and like in Indo-European, you've got masculine, feminine, vegetable, that they have a special class for edible plants, and then neuter. All right. And just like in Indo-European languages, these are not exactly sometimes they don't make sense. Like in German, why is a girl Mädchen? Why is a girl neuter? Because it's diminutive, it becomes a neuter. So you have words like these as well in these languages that sometimes, okay, it's not quite like some animals. Most animals are masculine, but some types of birds, and I think even fish or some sea animals are feminine. So things like that don't quite follow the expected system that that you would think about. So for example, so I don't speak this language, but I think it's very interesting. The gender marking is usually found in the adjectives, and just like in European languages, demonstrative. So the words of that, this, that, and adjectives big, small, they will have a prefix that shows the gender. Kind of like in Swahili, in Bantu languages, the prefix changes. Yeah. So the word doesn't take an ending to show the gender. Like in European languages, it changes in the beginning. So like the word for that old man, right, will be namekbe nagokbain, or that man namekbe pinij. So some nouns. So the word for that is mekbe, but it will take a prefix that shows the gender. Na, ngal, man, or kun. In this case, so na is masculine, ngal is feminine. Any plant, vegetable matter is man. And other than that is kun. So the words for meat, for example, will be kungan. Yeah, so kun mekbe kungan, and kun mekbe balanda. Okay, so balanda means European, but of course in Australia, European is English. So that English language will be kun mekbe balanda. All right, so that's how they use it. You probably notice that some nouns also have a prefix, but that's irregular. So you have to learn. When you learn a noun, right? You have to know whether it takes a prefix or not. So like the words like man and woman, pinyin, daluk, they don't have prefixes. But the word for old man and old man, you've got nagotbain, ngangotbain. So it just depends on the word. You have to learn it by heart. And of course, some words are irregular. Like they are. You might think they come from one group, but they're actually the other. Kind of like European languages as well. So that's very interesting. These languages also have a lot of noun incorporation. If you're learning Nawat, classical Nawat, you can make extremely long words. They do this. You don't find this so much further south, like Aranda, Warlpiri, they don't have as much. These people do love long, complex words. So this whole sentence is basically one word. It means the country gets ruined with many deep mines. That's one word. And it breaks down into, a lot of smaller parts. All right. So literally it's like there is the first word, the ga, it shows a third person singular object. So the country singular. And then you put the word country, you put the word deep and many, and then you have other things as well. All right. The ending, I think it's I'm not sure. I think it's a past tense. Let me see, guess, but non-past. So it's something that's happening in the present ending. All right. Things like this. I'm going to cut my hair. That's one word as well. So you have I, the nga is I. So throughout Australia, very, very often the word for I is nga. You find it, doesn't matter whether it's Pamanungan, non-Pamanungan, or whatever, whichever family, you find nga to be very, very common. And then head and hair, it's all crammed inside there with the word to cut. And you have the suffix that shows repetition. Re is like it shows it's ongoing, and then you have something like non-past ending. So this language also has a distinction between non-past and past tense. All right, so that's just how it goes. Yeah. Now I'm just going to see if we have enough time. Okay, we'll spend a couple more minutes and then we'll go into more of the sociolinguistics. All right, so yeah, that's about it. So if any questions, just you can type them down or ask me after this. Now, Australia is quite interesting in that almost all the regions have certain things in common. Number one, many of them have what's called the mother-in-law language or an avoidance register. It depends on region to region. In most regions, men are not supposed to speak with their mother-in-law. In others, they can speak to them, but they have to use a very complicated, a different register of the language. Like if you learn Korean, you have the casual speech and the formal speech. Japanese, you've got keigo. If you learn Javanese, you've got different levels. You've kromo, you've got modyo, you've got the ngoko levels of speech. They exist as well in most of the Australian languages. So they have a special set of vocabulary that you only use when you're talking about your mother-in-law, for example. In areas, for example, the Warlpiri areas, traditionally men did not speak to their mother-in-laws. If they have to, they would have to ask their wife or their children, can please tell grandma this. Even if they're in the same house, they're not supposed to even share the same room, be in the same room. they avoid them. In other areas, you can, but there are certain protocol you have to speak to her in a special way, or use a special register to speak to her. I think in Warlpiri, you use a special register when you're talking about your mother-in-law. So you tell your wife, oh, can you ask your mother to do this? So when you say, can you ask your mother? There's a special vocabulary that you have to use. Ask her to do this. I think they use the plural when they're asking, talking about the mother-in-law. So like, can you ask her to come here, or to go and take care of the grandchildren? So you ask them to take care of grandchildren, and they have other verbs as well that are different to do this. And there are also other types of language avoidance registers. For example, men will have to use specific forms when they're talking to I think it's also the people from the father's side of the family in some groups, or their brothers-in-law. There's specific forms of, and you find different variations of this all over Australia. Another thing is sign language. Almost every region has their own sign language. So you would use sign language in specific circumstances. In some areas, for example, when a woman's husband passes away, she doesn't speak for during the mourning period, and she would use sign language. Men will use sign language when they go hunting, for example. So it's very common. In some cases, I think in some groups as well, when a boy undergoes initiation, so they do what's called men's business. So they become a man. You go through a ritual for a certain number of, or certain practice, certain things that you do. During that time, either you cannot talk to them, or they can talk to some people, like their parents. They have to speak to somebody. Or in some areas you can use sign language. It depends on the region. That changes a lot. Then there's also ceremonial language. So there's a language that's used, for example, in, I think, Mornington Island. I forget which area. When boys go through a certain ritual and become a man, they will start speaking in a very specific type of the same language, the same grammar, but they will replace the vocabulary with other words. They will use that, and they will only speak that way to other men who are grown up. With women and children, they would use the normal language, things like that. So all over Australia, you have different variations of this, and it's very common. Now, sadly, in many areas, these languages are either no longer practiced because they've lost the culture. In some areas, people have become Christian. They don't do their traditional practices anymore. Sadly, in other areas, of course, the modern lifestyle, it becomes difficult to maintain this kind of language, which I think is a pity. So that's me. That's regarding this area. Now, moving on, let's look at some of the, I will just skip this. All right, so current status, I'm just going to hurry along a little bit. So so we're looking at different numbers here. So like I said, most linguists say between 200 to 300 languages. They've all been in severe decline. So even in the 1980s, these are statistics from the 80s and early 90s. By the early 80s, 25% of them are already extinct. 50% are on the verge. This is the 1980s, so now it's even worse. Only about a quarter of the languages that were that were from the pre-European contact period were still healthy in the 1980s and early 90s. And then in 1990, you got I haven't seen the latest statistics. I don't have them, but I think it's probably worse than this. 60% are either extinct or have very few elderly speakers left. Right? So only about 8% are relatively healthy, and I think this is even worse now. The past 20, 30 years, things might have gotten worse for some languages. There are one or two languages where the speakers have actually increased, which is a good sign, but yeah, generally no. You can actually see this in this map, the statistics, like on the left, those are areas where like 79% or more of the population of the indigenous population speaks the language. All right. So that's in those areas on the left, the pink areas there. All right. But it's an interesting correlation. If you look at the map on the right, that's in the 19th century, those are the areas that were settled by Europeans. So basically those areas where Europeans set foot in, those were the ones where the languages are either extinct or endangered. Yeah. So that's the pattern. You can see this very, very clearly from the map, right? So yeah, unfortunately, that's what happened. So again, now, so we'll be going through this again. Now, if you're talking about languages, why they're going extinct, well, obviously there are things that the Australian government has been doing in the past to try to, civilize. Of course, from the things I've been telling you, that these people come from very, very, very ancient cultures. They have a lot of history, very complex complex customs like the avoidance register, all this, that of course the European missionaries didn't care about. All they wanted was teach them to be Christian and become civilized, unfortunately. And that's why the Australian government, you've heard of things like the stolen generation, children who were forced into boarding schools to learn English and become Christian. Yeah, so these are the primary causes of the extinction of the language. And of course, a lot of conflicts as well. Disease that were brought by Europeans in the 19th century, unfortunately, killed a lot of the population as well. So yeah, so like in Tasmania, hardly anything is left. There are lists of vocabulary written down by maybe missionaries, or anthropologists in the 19th century that people are using to reconstruct the language. But in Tasmania, the information is so scant, people don't know whether they're even the same language or the same dialect or same language. So they just combine bits and pieces together to create something called Palawakani. If you read about it, it's sort of like a reconstructed language, but it's not one language, it's bits of different dialects and languages put together, because, and nobody really knows how many languages were spoken in Tasmania, because that was one of the first areas to go, like where the languages went completely extinct. All right. Yeah, so that's that. If you're interested, here are some sort of organizations you can look at. You want to know more, the Kimberley Language Resource Center. I think what I'll do is, if you want more information, just message me. I will show you. I will put my email. Send me an email or something. If you're watching this recording, then obviously you can just freeze and copy it down if you want to know more. All right. So these are organizations. And my contact is brian@utalk.com, or Brian Lusunhua on Facebook. Feel free to add me and say hi if you want to know more. All right. I'm actually working on one of the languages that's spoken in the Sydney, Newcastle area specifically, and where it's probably the first Aboriginal language to be written down, to be recorded by a missionary, and to have the Bible translated into that language. So me and our team were working on breaking down the Bible, not breaking down the Bible, breaking down the sentence structures used in the Bible translation, and to try to revive or bring back the language that probably went extinct in the late 19th century. So it's like we're talking about 150 years ago, it went extinct approximately. We're not really sure when, so we're looking at that as well. That's what I'm doing. And then, before I finish, UTalk has a special offer. If you want 50% off on all languages, go to this link. It's utalk.com/plan/PC Global. Okay, that's it. All right, I think I'm done. Let me just stop sharing. And if you have any questions, now's the time. All right, now's the time. If any questions, or you can type them out, or you can just tell me. Yeah, we're 45 minutes in. Any questions or anything that you'd like to know more about?
Hi, Brian. Just
Hello.
a technical question about the sentence "kabul chorok chorok warmene." What's inch stands for?
Encode, to become.
Encode. Yeah, I was thinking. And then NP, the hen.
NP, non-past. So it's either present or future.
Okay.
Non-past. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Welcome. Any other questions or anything you want to know?
Yes. So you said that the sentence structure is really free. Or the word order is what I mean. So I was wondering, do sentences have maybe different nuances depending on where you put the word?
Yes. So usually in language like Warlpiri, for example, when you put the sentence towards before the auxiliary, you can emphasize it. So like for example, in questions, usually the question will come at the front, like where is this, who did you see, that kind of thing, who did this. So that kind of question, or what did you eat, that usually comes at the beginning before the auxiliary, and then after that you can scramble it. It's a bit more free after that. So that's how you can do this. So usually anything that you want to emphasize, you put closer to the beginning of the sentence. That's how they do it. I hope I answered it.
I have a question though. Mother-in-law avoiding, is it because it's polite, or they don't want to have a sexual relation? Or what is the reason for avoiding one's mother-in-law?
Good question. Very good question. I don't know. I have to ask my Aboriginal friends. It's a very strong taboo. So it's either to show politeness because of possible conflicts, all right? But there are some anthropologists say also it could be of sexual relations with a mother-in-law. That is a no-no. It could also be, you could also be right. Yeah, that could also be, but I have to ask my Aboriginal friends, see what they say.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, you're right. It could be one of those two. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another technical question, Brian, down Arrernte, there was reduction of many PPN vowels. To show what is the PPN vowels?
PP?
PPN vowels.
Oh, sorry. I have to go and check it again. Let me see. Aranda. Let me just go and see. I can't remember where I put it. PPN. Let me just go down to. I have to go but find my slide. Let me see. 1 minute. Proto-Nyungan. Proto-Nyungan. So the ancestral language that was recreated of that family. So it's like Proto-Indo-European roughly. So nobody knows exactly. It's just a reconstruction, and the reconstructed form in Aranda they've reduced many of the vowels. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other question? I think we're already past 45 minutes. But yeah, if
I would like to ask a question. So first of all, thank you very much. It was really interesting. And
thank you. You're welcome.
I would like to know more about the sign language. I'm really curious about. So do you know if they start learning the sign language in their childhood, or since they become a man since this time?
Very good question. The ones that I know about, what my friends tell me, for example, growing up, they use that from childhood. So children will learn it. I will put a link to this website here that if you can see it, it's Iljam, which I think I've shared it. Oh, yeah, so it's a visual recording of all most of the major sign languages throughout in different parts. I think that's more Central Australian. Yeah, in central and northern territory and a lot of the central desert area. Yeah, you can take a look at it, and that's how in of course different languages have different sign language as well. But the sign language is always a representation of the spoken language. So when you use the structure, they will follow the same. So like the word order, if it's free, it will follow the free word order, that kind of structure. So it's a visual representation of the spoken language. Actually, that's why it's different from every tribe because of different languages. Yeah.
So this is really interesting. Thanks. So yeah,
yes.
and I can see on the pictures you just sent it with the link. They are women too who are speaking the sign language. So it's just not just for boys, but women also.
Yes, it depends on the group. In some areas, everybody uses it. In some, everybody knows it. But when they use it, it depends on the tribe. In some areas, women don't use it when they're in mourning. In others, it's used for hunting or both. Or it really depends. Yeah. It depends. There's also a taboo against using the name of a person who just passed away. They never say the name, so they would use something to replace. Depending on the area, they would use it to replace the person's name. So if somebody named Jean passed away, then give me the genes. They would use something to replace that. Don't say the person's name. And it can be for a few months, a few years, it depends. And I suspect this is why the languages evolve in certain ways, because they would often borrow words from other languages or create a new word. And that became so popular, it replaced the original word. So the language kind of evolved. That helped to increase, encourage the language to evolve. So that's also a very strong taboo, naming a dead person. And in some places, it's so strong you cannot even listen to a person's voice recording. You can look at an image of the person, so they would either throw them away or discard them. Even the person's things, belongings, they just throw it away. So that's part of the culture.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Really interesting.
Most
thank you.
Most welcome. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's it. Anybody else? We've got less than 10 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, no.
Yes, I have a question.
Oh, hi, Karina. Yeah.
Hi. You said that there's one group from Sulawesi immigrated, and that's why there are lots of borrowings from this language.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was more contact between Austronesian languages and Australian languages, like through trade or several other migrations. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. little bit. So this is interesting. The languages don't show like long, like it's not a long-term contact. It's only usually in vocabulary that's been borrowed, which means that it's quite recent. You would expect to have more contact with the Austronesian languages, but we don't see it so much. There is some Austronesian influence in the Torres Straits. So the Kalau Nagoya, that language area, some of that language and the dialects, they have some Austronesian words, but they came likely from the coast of Papua New Guinea. So it wasn't also quite recently. So I don't really know how to explain it, but yeah, it's like an island that is usually free of Austronesian languages, except only in the very far north. Then that's very recent. I don't know. I would expect more people to sail to the coast then, but the coastal languages in the south and all, they don't have any Austronesian influence, as far as I know. So yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how to answer this very in a comprehensive way. Yeah, but the only contact so far, like, is only in the northern strip, yeah, and the Torres Straits, as far as I know. Yeah, I hope that answers.